Good morning. Welcome to the online workshop and seminar on inclusion in local and international academic communities. I'm Liudvika Leišytė, professor of higher education at TU Dortmund University in Germany, as well as the chair of Futura Scientia association that unites young and also experienced academics who have degrees from abroad and who are Lithuanian in Lithuania. It's my honor and pleasure to be the moderator of this workshop, and we will start with a series of welcome speeches with distinguished guests coming from the Lithuanian higher education context. These include just a moment, I have to check the. Yes. These include Odeta Merfeldaitė, the Dean of Faculty of Human and Social Studies, Mykolas Romeris University in Lithuania, Mr. Tadas Juknevičius, who is the head of the Division of Science, at the Ministry of Education, Science and Sport, as well as the representative from the sponsor of this event, Eva Pranka. She's the executive director of Baltic German University Liaison Office. So it's really the pleasure and honor to welcome everyone and to have our dear guests and a row of wonderful speakers. The floor is yours, Odeta.
Thank you, Liudvika. Dear colleagues, welcome to the webinar, which addressed an important issue of the role and mission of contemporary science. Science is the basic for the long-term accumulation of human capital, without which sustainable, balanced development and governance of society is unthinkable. The purpose of science is to contribute to the socially and economically sustainable, intelligent growth of society and the individual to respond, to predict, and shape the needs of times. Thus, science has a duty not only to address the current issues of social life, but also to create scenarios for the future. Having such a mission, it faces many challenges. Scientific work is not an abstract entity. The essence of it is active researchers. However, the expectation and requirements for them changes very rapidly. We can't imagine anymore a researcher who works alone in a lab or library and publish his or her lifelong results once or twice in their life. Nowadays, a researcher, along with his or her research activities, is writer, promoter, manager of his her intellectual property, international relations, communication specialist, and so on. At the same time, the researcher has to implement his or her direct duty and be involved in national and international networks. Knowledge building became an open and contextual process. How to survive and progress in such a complex situation. How to make a fruitful dialogue between researchers, policymakers, and knowledge users. I hope that this webinar and discussion will give insights for such questions and support researchers in their challenging journeys. We're not looking for recipe or defined answers, but for a dialogue leading to prosperous research. I wish us a fruitful discussion. Thank you for your attention.
Hello, everyone, dear guests, dear colleagues, dear participants. Thank you for the invitation to join this discussion and to say a few welcoming words. First of all, I was thinking about communities and what I can say from the perspective of the ministry. So I guess government and the ministry has two main tools to foster and to develop science policy. I guess it's evaluation and funding. So firstly, I will talk about evaluation. So it's quite new sphere in Lithuania, it's developed over the last, I guess, 20 years. We started with formal evaluation, counting articles, citations, and so on. And as you can understand, it's not so involving all the community. It's just numbers and counting single articles. But recently, like 6 years ago, situation changed when a research assessment exercise were introduced into our research system, when groups of researchers were evaluated, and not only the articles, citations, and formal criteria, but we try to evaluate research quality of that group, socioeconomic impact of that group, and the perspective of that group in the nearest future. So evaluation changed more to the communities, more to the groups of researchers. Another part is funding. And of course, funding is very important in stimulating and giving some signals to researchers how they should work. So I will talk mainly more about competitive funding because it's more oriented to researchers groups to create communities, to form strong research groups within our universities, among our universities and international area. So one of the measures was to support communities and scientific associations. So I guess that measure is still on. And in this way, we try to create more communities, more involvement of researchers and working together. Of course, all the competitive funding, all the grant schemes are encouraging to create research groups to involve young researchers in order to foster the research community. And one strong aspect is involvement into international communities. So we always try to stimulate more active and more successful participation in Horizon program, Horizon Europe. In the future, there will be Horizon Europe program, and we are trying to accelerate our participation. On the other hand, we have joined a number of international research infrastructures that are included into S3 roadmaps. So it's one of the ways to be a part of international communities. We also developed some measures to foster Lithuania and participation in European research area. So there will be a plan in the coming future how to participate more actively. And the last but not least, one of the initiatives currently running in Lithuania is mission-oriented research policy. So we are talking about not only researchers communities, but involving much more broader scope of institutions, different actors from business to society. So I guess we can talk about research policy in different levels and involving different stakeholders and creating different communities. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion today and to get more insights about the communities and how we can foster them and make them viable and be part of research community. So thank you very much and wish you a fruitful discussion.
Good morning, dear ladies and gentlemen. I'm very thankful and delighted to greet you before the open virtual seminar, Inclusion in Local and International Academic Communities, within the project of the same title. The project is supported with funds of the Baltic German University Liaison Office, to which I would like to introduce you briefly. The aim of our office, Baltic German University Liaison Office, is to function as a scientific bridge between the Baltic states and Germany, moreover to provide a platform for scholars and scientists to discuss topical issues of science. And we are aiming to play an active role by initiating and strengthening scientific ties among Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Germany through our annual project competition. And I'm really pleased about the decision to support the project because it is focused on the inclusion of academics in local and foreign communities, which in a way is also the main aim of the Baltic German University liaison office. And this time, the situation in Lithuania will be discussed from the Baltic states. But I would like to emphasize that these and also much more other questions regarding the academic communities are topical also in Latvia and in Estonia. Therefore, I hope that this successful cooperation will be continued, including also other Baltic neighbors. And it is a great pleasure to cooperate with Ms. Eleonora Dagiene and her team. And I would like to thank the whole project team and also German partners for their interest in cooperation and participation in seminar and discussion tomorrow. And I would also like to invite all other scientists and academic staff to consider cooperation with German universities and research institutions and to take part in our project competition. For now, I wish all of us an interesting event and fruitful discussions, and thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thank you very much, Eva, Franka, Tadas Juknevičius, and Odeta Merfeldaitė for your introductory talks and insights, and congratulations. I would like to continue to the speeches. Before I do that, I would like to introduce the first speaker. The first speaker is Professor Jochen Gläser, who is professor at TU Berlin. He's a professor of science studies of science and technology, and also the head of department there. And it's a professorship in cooperation with Berlin Brandenburg Academy of Sciences and Humanities. Jochen Gläser is a renowned scholar across the world. He has published numerous very influential books and articles on questions of especially focusing on the sociology of science. He has a very international career, so I think for the topic today, it's very, very wonderful to have him as a first speaker and also as a partner in the project. So in his career, he has been working not only in Germany, he's been working in Australia, he's been working also in the UK, and until now he is also affiliated to universities in the UK. And he's been absolutely influential and doing a wonderful job in connecting with different scholars across different countries and cultures and working and collaborating with them. So I think this is really a fantastic opportunity that we have here to listen to Jochen's presentation and his work. And today he will be focusing, of course, on the topic that is close to the topic of this online workshop. And today he will talk about inclusion in international scientific communities and he will focus at this topic from the governance point of view. So inclusion in international scientific communities as a governance issue. So with no further ado, Jochen, the floor is yours. If you would like to share the screen and maybe say a few words about yourself as well.
I will thank you, Liudvika, for the kind introduction. Just let me, something strange happened here. You don't have to see my calendar, so this is better. So now, again, many thanks for the kind introduction and many thanks to the Hochschulkontor for making this workshop possible. I'm involved in several otherwise unconnected projects that, as a common background, have the inclusion of researchers in their international scientific communities. And once I noticed that, it became a theoretical obsession, and I'm looking at everything now from the perspective of inclusion in international scientific communities. And so I'm very glad to apply my considerations to a new issue. I would like to do the following today. I would like to first introduce my perspective on inclusion. And secondly, I think it is very important to talk about the limitation of my own perspective, which is then whenever you look at inclusion in international scientific community, you don't look at inclusion in other social contexts. And third, I would like to discuss the impact of governance on inclusion, and fourth, at specific problems of small science systems. And I have to announce immediately, point 4 is highly speculative because science studies haven't done enough on small science systems. So the whole impact of varying size of national science systems on knowledge production is grossly under-researched. But let's start with the first point, which is the knowledge production by international communities. Can I somehow get rid of this line here? Just let me know. I can't. Why does this start? Okay. Anyway, the starting point is that knowledge is not produced by individual researchers, but by international scientific communities. So we have a communal production of scientific knowledge. Scientific knowledge is jointly advanced by communities of researchers that are distributed, who are distributed all over the world. And what the individual does is they contribute locally produced knowledge that will be integrated into the community's knowledge, or as the case might be, will not be integrated. If nobody reads what you try to contribute, if nobody uses what you try to contribute, then local contributions are not used and don't contribute to the advancement of the community's knowledge. Now, the sociology so this is a very generic model, which has played a role in the sociology of science for quite a while. And this very generic model abstracts from the variation of researchers' participation in knowledge production. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is that traditional models of scientific communities, the models that have been advanced by Robert Merton, Thomas Kuhn, and Hagström, assume the equality of community members. If you look at Merton's scientific efforts, at Kuhn's model of paradigms and paradigm change, and of Hagström's exchange model, they implicitly assume the equality of community members. Now, over time, this assumption has been challenged. And I hope I got the historic order right. It has first been challenged by work on the stratification in scientific communities. So this was Kohl and Zuckerman, who said, well, no, not all members of a community are equal. We have a scientific elite. And this scientific elite is much more influential than any other researcher. And then we have possibly one segment below the elite, and then we have all others. So this was early 70s, early 1970s. Then next thing, of course, people started to notice that there are gender inequalities, that female researchers are not equal to male researchers in most scientific communities. And there has been extensive research on gender inequalities in research. Next thing happening was that people noticed north-south inequalities. And again, it turned out that researchers in the global south are not equal to researchers in the global north. And there is a rapidly developing literature on that. And finally, and I think that this is more recent, people notice the disadvantages of minorities in the global north in research, and started discussing this. So what you see is that if we look empirically, there is not so much equality of community members. And there are some elements in which all community members are equal. They are considered by communities. So with regard to the expectations by communities, the abstract expectation is that all its members work with the community's knowledge and offer contributions. So at this very abstract level of community expectations, members are equal. In many other respects, they are not. And these inequalities I've listed here have been discussed in the literature, mainly from a political perspective as problems of fairness. So that was with all these things, except maybe for the elite discussion, that is the main thrust of the discussion. What this means from a theoretical perspective, which I become interested in, is that the traditional model of a scientific community is far too simple, because it disregards the variation of inclusion, and it disregards that we have to look at inclusion at the individual level, and that there is much more inclusion, variation of inclusion, than we have seen with the current empirical work. So that there is differences in inclusion in the global north, that there are inclusion differences between science systems and within science systems, and that we have to look at it more extensively and with a theoretical perspective in mind to understand how scientific communities work. So that's my obsession, and there we come to inclusion. What do I mean by inclusion? I mean by inclusion the way in which a researcher performs in their role as a member of a scientific community. I already said discussed the basic elements of that role: work with the community's knowledge, offer contributions to advance this knowledge. So what are the role expectations? What is expected from a member of the scientific community? The creation of contributions to the community's knowledge, the communication of contributions to one's community, and the participation in the community's decision-making. So these are the elements, because communities have somehow to decide on communication structures, on directions of research, and the participation of community members is expected. So these are the expectations we have. These define how well researchers are included in their international scientific communities. Now, let's look at possible sources of variation of these expectations. And we can look at the role expectations and at the variation. So with regard to the creation of contributions to the community's knowledge, the topic, numbers of contributions, relevance, and quality of contributions all vary between researchers. So that's the first source of variation of inclusion. With regard to the communication of contributions, the communication channels used vary. For example, do I go attend conferences? Do I publish in journals? Do I publish in books? how well am I integrated in informal international networks where knowledge is, of course, also communicated. So this is a second source of variation of inclusion. And I remember a very interesting article from the beginning of the 1990s, where a Chinese colleague looked at the inclusion of Chinese researchers in research on high temperature superconductivity. And he found that in the beginning, with the first discovery of materials for high temperature superconductivity, Chinese researchers were as well integrated in international scientific communities as anybody else, but they soon lost out because they were not part of the informal networks of high temperature superconductivity researchers internationally. So this is a very important aspect of international integration. And finally, and the third expectation, participation in the community's decision-making. And here, there is, of course, a variation in the positions of influence. How can I influence the community's knowledge production? Editorships, editorial boards, peer review functions, membership of panels that decide on research proposals, membership of conference committees, being host of conferences, membership in professional associations, advisory boards of projects and organizations, and so on. So we have here already a huge source of variation of inclusion of researchers in international communities. So now, very briefly, what are the consequences of limited inclusion? Why is this worth talking about at all? And there are essentially two reasons. What's happening here? Let me see. For scientific communities, if many of its members are not well included, the scientific communities lose out on epistemic diversity. The rapid progress of scientific communities depends on problems being addressed from as many scientific perspectives as possible at the same time. This is the role of epistemic diversity. If you work under conditions of extreme uncertainty, and most scientific communities do because they produce new knowledge, if you don't even know what the problem is, let alone how it can be solved or who could solve it, then it makes sense for scientific communities to try out as many different formulations of research problems and approaches to solving them as possible in parallel. And this is what constantly happens. And this is the role community members play. They apply their individual perspective on the community's knowledge and what the problem might be, and try to solve this particular problem and offer the solutions to the community. Now, if members are not fully included in their scientific communities, they don't have that possibility, and the epistemic diversity reduces. So this is the loss to the scientific community. Fewer different attempts at problem solving, which might mean less progress. And for any society, of course, if its researchers aren't properly included in international scientific communities, this reduces the access to international knowledge. So that is a very important aspect of that. There is in organizational sociology, there has been a very influential article on research in industry and its role as absorptive capacity, arguing that commercial enterprises have research divisions to be able to access the knowledge that is produced outside the enterprise. And a similar idea can be applied to societies. So societies have a national science base to access the knowledge that is produced internationally. And if their societies' researchers are only partly included in international scientific communities, this access to international knowledge is reduced. So now if we look at reasons why inclusion varies, we find three possible reasons. The researchers' decisions might lead to limited inclusion. The opportunities and constraints under which a researcher conducts research might limit inclusion, and decisions by others that are completely external to the whole national situation might limit the inclusion. To give you just one example of these decisions by others, you just have to think back on what the US did under Donald Trump to travel, to international travel, and limitations to travel from certain countries imposed by the Trump administration, which led to the impossibility of researchers from several countries to attend conferences in the US. And we had this at the Science Studies conference. So this is something like very simple visa restrictions imposed in the global north, affecting the inclusion of researchers elsewhere. So just to give you one example. And of course, decisions by others and opportunities and constraints affect the decisions of researchers. So to have a closer look at a researcher's decisions, which decisions may affect the inclusion. First, decisions in the researcher role, and there we come back to the three role expectations I mentioned earlier. So decisions on the selection of research problems and approaches. Do I choose a problem at the center of a community's concerns, or do I move into a niche? Decisions to collaborate, decisions on how I communicate, decisions to take on positions of influence to participate in decision processes. All these decisions affect researchers' inclusion in their international scientific communities, but also decisions to invest in other roles. And this is where a very important aspect of this inclusion perspective comes into play. The decision to invest in the application of results, the decision to invest in teaching, the decision to invest in other roles are at least at the level of time I can spend on my inclusion in my international scientific community. These decisions are competing. So this is a very important point, because a partial inclusion in international scientific communities does not mean that the researchers in question do less or do nothing. It might well mean that they do something different. And this is very important to have in mind. So the perspective I'm presenting here, the perspective on inclusion in international scientific communities, is limited in that regard. So we have to look at inclusion in other social contexts, so to speak. So yes, that would be the conclusion of this juxtaposition. Limited inclusion in international scientific communities may be due to the decision to invest in other roles other than that of a community member in that particular community. So, and just to give you some empirical examples, something science studies have turned to. Schramm and Campion in 2000 investigated the question whether researchers in the global south are isolated. because they are less well included in international scientific communities. And they found that they have rather strong national and regional networks, and that there is something like a zero-sum game, so to speak. So stronger inclusion in national networks of scientists means less inclusion in international networks, and vice versa. So international and national networks of scientists in the global south are inversely related. The one gets bigger, the other gets smaller. A study of Ugandan PhDs in 2016 found that Ugandan researchers who do a full-time PhD abroad often have difficulties when returning because they became disconnected from local networks at home. And these are not only personal networks, but they are also scientific networks. So it suddenly turns out that your local networks are very important when you want agricultural research, to give just one example. You have to know people to get interesting samples. So again, we see that stronger international inclusion might come at a cost where local and regional inclusion is involved. And finally, a very interesting article by Chavao et al. In 2017. They looked at the question of why some researchers publish in non-mainstream, which they operationalized as non-Web of Science journals, and found that one reason is to provide information to communities with limited access to mainstream journals. So they did exactly what I described as absorptive capacity earlier on. They are bridging, communicating knowledge that is locally relevant, that has been produced internationally. So these decisions to invest in other roles are very interesting and result in something like an individual inclusion profile of researchers. And that might vary a lot between researchers. So, and this is where I'm moving to governance, because reducing performance evaluation to the assessment of inclusion in international scientific communities may be detrimental in that it disincentivizes other contributions. And this is a big point of discussion with some science studies scholars from the global south who say, well, their governments follow the international trend in using certain indicators for research quality, quantitative indicators, impact factors, search index, whatever. You can have a long list, citations in these Web of Science journals, and so on and so on. And there are science studies scholars from the global south who argue that the application of these indicators does not sufficiently value local contributions, so that there is some misdirection involved here. And I would go as far as saying that our indicator-based evaluations and peer review-based evaluations share something like an inclusion bias, because in order to measure scientific quality, we use international inclusion in international scientific communities. These two are inseparable in this kind of evaluation. And this researchers recognized, science studies scholars recognized, might be a problem in countries where this bridging function I mentioned with the last contribution here might be important. Now, this brings me to the question of governance affecting inclusion, and I would briefly say, well, if we grossly simplify it, then what does the governance of science do? It communicates expectations towards researchers, and it provides researchers, and very often the two are linked, because the provision of researchers is tied to particular expectations. And these, of course, affects researchers' decisions and the opportunities and constraints under which researchers learn. Now, we can look at the general governance of society, and we will find that it creates important background conditions. Salaries, gendered care roles, provision of care, regulation of international travel, equal opportunity policies, all are general background conditions that affect how well researchers can be included in their international scientific communities, but the decisions they make and the opportunities and constraints they face. So that's the very, very general influence of governance, both of governance of science and of general governance on inclusion. So inclusion in international scientific communities is only partly shaped by the governance of science. There are general societal background conditions that shape it as well, and is often unintentionally affected by it. So the governance of science is not all about inclusion. It is about many things, but these many things might unintentionally affect the inclusion in international scientific community. Which brings me to specific aspects of small science system. And I must repeat, this is what I'm going to say is largely hypothetical, because we don't have enough research on this. So it is more of a list of possible problems, possible specific problems that can be derived from general considerations in the sociology of science. And you, my audience, know much better whether this applies at all. That's something I'm going to say in advance. So additional factors affecting inclusion. Problems achieving critical mass for producing contributions in resource-intensive fields. So a bigger science system simply has more resources to shift around to achieve critical mass. Attention between the necessary epistemic diversity of teaching and the necessary concentration of research. This has to do with the integration with the research teaching nexus at universities. We feel this as, at all universities. Whenever universities try to set priorities in research, they face the tension that they have to uphold a broad epistemic diversity of teaching, and these university teachers want to do research. So this is a general tension in universities, and of course, it can be expected to be more of a tension in small science systems. What we actually see in some smaller science systems, which is possible, is a stronger international inclusion due to the absence of national communities. So you would say that Germany has a very lively sociological community, national community, but German researchers do have to decide whether they want to integrate nationally more strongly or internationally more strongly. Again, this is partly a zero-sum game. And we know, for example, that Dutch researchers in the humanities publish much more in English than German researchers in the humanities. A stronger conflict between local and international inclusion because role differentiation is not possible. Odeta mentioned in the beginning the many tasks scientists have and science has today. Now, large science systems are much better able to distribute these tasks between researchers. And in small science systems, we would sociologically expect a much stronger pressure on the fewer researchers to do it all at the same time. And finally, we do expect, for the same reason, a stronger effect of the inclusion bias of evaluations, the inseparability of quality and international inclusion. This I already explained. We measure research quality essentially via international inclusion. And if researchers need to do everything at the same time, we would expect a stronger effect of that inclusion bias. Which brings me to a few conclusions. First, a researcher's inclusion in their international scientific communities is shaped by a multitude of factors, which I tried to outline, many of which are beyond the control of researchers or national science policies. That's a very important point. Then that's my theoretical obsession of unifying the whole thing. The same types of causes and mechanisms appear to be at work across all the limitations of inclusion that have been empirically observed so far. In some cases, a trade-off appears to exist between inclusion in international scientific communities and inclusion in local contexts of application. Societal governance affects inclusion through shaping background conditions. And the governance of science affects inclusion through communicating expectations and providing opportunities for producing and communicating contributions, and by paying attention, constraints on the opportunities for producing them. And finally, small science systems appear to face particular challenges because inclusion partly depends on a concentration of effort, which may be at odds with the necessary epistemic diversity of teaching and the need for societal impact. Thank you. And I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Jochen, for this really fantastic overview and theoretical thinking behind the question of inclusion. We have some time now for questions. So if anyone would like to pose questions to the speaker, please write it in the chat.
It's really strange when you can't see your audience.
I think this is indeed a challenge. To kick off, maybe I would like to ask you, in the literature of higher education, this issue of inclusion, especially in terms of international inclusion, there are two different concepts that are usually used. Olbach has written a lot about centers and peripheries. And also there is that, which is more about systems. And then when thinking about academics or researchers at the micro level, they're cosmopolitans and locals. So these are the typologies basically coming out from empirical research. So how do you think this would be helpful or not helpful, maybe, to use thinking about small systems? Is it good to be a periphery or be framed as a periphery, for example? I'm
a bit reluctant with the center periphery thing. First of all, yes, there are centers plural and peripheries plural. So, for example, I'm participating in a study on the field of international relations in political science. Now, if you look at that, you find 5,000 international relations researchers in the US. Now, they are not all elite. there is a huge periphery of people nobody knows about doing all sorts of things nobody knows. So you do have a periphery in this particular field in the US. I have a PhD student who visiting, not one of mine, but visiting our unit, who investigates members of the scientific elite in Denmark. Now, so what do we do with the center periphery thing? I think it is an interesting notion, but it has to be applied very, very carefully. And I would be reluctant to put any whole science system at the periphery. You have to look at fields and you have to look at concrete relationships within fields. This is what I'd say. We have to get away from this block thinking, so to speak, and even a century periphery differentiation still uses this block thinking in a way. And yes, cosmopolitans and local is a very interesting distinction, because it, from my view, is, let's say, ideal types of combinations of certain roles. As I said, the people who are fully focused on their integration in international scientific communities would be cosmopolitans. Locals would be people who invest in other roles as well. So yes, I can see that as a combination, as representing different patterns of inclusion, so to speak, in international scientific communities and local environments.
Yeah, thank you. This gives further food for thought, I think, especially the systematic view on peripheries and thinking about small systems, especially. So they can be maybe also centers within the small systems and peripheries within the small systems. We have a question from Birute. How can a state reward system for research enthusiasm be improved? Could be improved. How a state reward system for research enthusiasm could be improved. So if I understand it correctly, it's how this reward system can promote research enthusiasm, or a reward research enthusiasm.
Yeah.
Enthusiasm. I think that's what the Birute meant. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's a dilemma. So my first spontaneous answer would be to give people the opportunity to investigate what they want to investigate. Because I already said for the progress of knowledge and for individual progress, it is very important that you try out your own view at the knowledge of your community and what's important. And then possibly even against the majority opinion of a scientific community, try to convince them that what you do is important and is right. So that is one thing. For small science systems, I think that would mean to have strong programs of sending people abroad and getting them back. So this is, there are many, I mean, a whole industry of training PhD students from Africa is built on that international funding to get them abroad. And the most important thing that turns out for this kind of effort, sending people abroad on all sorts of efforts, is providing them with the opportunity to continue their research at home once they come back. This is a systematic problem, because if you have these enthusiasts for research, you send them abroad, you let them integrate themselves in their international communities to get the aspirations of an international researcher, of a cosmopolitan, so to say. And then you come back. You have to be able, excuse me, You have to be able to realize these aspirations at home. Otherwise, your country won't benefit from you. And this is a very important thing. And this whole return thing after international PhDs has meanwhile been recognized as a problem for these programs. Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Jochen, very much. There will be more time for questions and discussion at the end, but time is running, so we have to move on. Therefore, I would like to invite the next speakers that we have today, Susanne Wollin-Giering and Markus Hoffmann. And Susanne will be the one who will be giving a presentation, also from Technical University in Berlin, working in the same group, as far as I understand, with Jochen Gläser, who will talk about losing touch, inclusion of unemployed researchers from a discipline-specific perspective. So Jochen, thank you very much. And I give now the floor to Susanne.
Okay. You can see all the presentation stuff without my comments, I guess. Yeah, hi from Berlin, Germany. I would like to introduce you to our presentation. We would like to raise the question whether unemployed researchers are still included in the scientific community or whether they lose touch. Yeah, as you said before, my name is Susanne Wollin-Giering and I'm presenting this with my colleague from our project, Markus Hoffmann. Just that you know what we will be talking, or I will be talking about in the next minutes, please have a look at the outline. First, I will start with some conceptual considerations, and after that I will talk about Germany as a special case, both in the academic career system as well as in its social security system concerning the unemployment problematic. Then I will explain a bit more about unemployment in academic careers and come to some selected results to show how researchers of two different disciplines are included in the scientific community. And after that, I will come to the conclusion. Yeah, before I go into detail about unemployment in researchers' careers and inclusion, I would like to briefly explain how most of the contributions to this workshop, namely contributions on research assessment, are thematically linked to unemployment, which is probably not obvious. Both research assessment and unemployment affect the organizational conditions for research. Research assessment comes with changes in the distribution of research resources, expectations regarding the involvement in specific communities. It designs specific career paths for researchers or introduces performance evaluation in order to distribute financial resources under the vision of improved productivity and efficiency of academia. Unemployment, on the other hand, is rather defined by the absence of resources that university was able to provide researchers with. And it comes with a loss of material research environments in form of laboratory infrastructure or financial resources, and a potential loss of access to local, national and international networks, just to mention some changes. How researchers process these research conditions and formulate and solve research problems within this setting is of interest, since researchers also try to align the problem formulation with their scientific community, while at the same time being thematically path dependent in choosing research topics. Yeah, looking at the micro level of the researcher and his research practices is, in the case of unemployment, approach that we will focus on in this presentation might also help in the analysis of research assessment and its effects. This might help to explain why, on the one hand, research assessment often fails to achieve its intended goals, or how, on the other hand, unemployed academics productively integrate unemployment into their careers. Yeah, the focus here is on how changed research conditions affect actual practices of knowledge production. When speaking of knowledge production practices, when speaking of knowledge productions, one comes definitely to the practices, scientific, one thinks definitely of the question of inclusion into scientific communities. And to begin with, scientific community can be defined as a joint production of knowledge where the collective action of the members is oriented towards the production of knowledge. Members of such scientific communities take part in the knowledge production process by observing a shared body of knowledge. They informally communicate with other members of the community about the body of knowledge. They derive scientific problems from the shared body of knowledge. They are working on the problem locally and autonomously, which means that they independently define, researchers independently define tasks under the reference of the community's knowledge. They simultaneously verify the knowledge of the scientific community. They offer also, and that is more the medium inclusion here, they are offering the problem solution in form of a new publication. What is not in the hands of the researchers is the decision on the acceptance, use, or reuse of the knowledge. This no longer depends on the researcher, but more on the reception by other researchers. Following that, we can come to the conclusion that inclusion can rather be understood as a continuum. As long as researchers conduct research activities that use the community's body of knowledge, there is a certain low inclusion. The highest inclusion will be reached when researchers offer knowledge to the other members of the community, which is used by them to produce further knowledge. So the question now is, to what extent are unemployed researchers included or excluded from the scientific community? How do they take part in the process of knowledge production when they don't have a job anymore? This is some sort of an empirical question that I will soon try to answer. And also I will especially take discipline-specific variations into account. Yeah. But now the question arises why unemployment might be a case of interest, since it might not be a very common phenomenon. But in Germany, it seems to happen quite often. But why? Most striking is the fact that the academic career system in Germany is still basically a habilitation system and not a tenure track system. In a habilitation system, there is a further phase of qualification following the doctorate. Attaining a permanent position, professor position, is only possible after this habilitation. Professorships in Germany are almost the only permanent positions, of which there are also only a few in relation to the rising number of academic staff beyond the professorship position. Also, the average age of appointment to a full professorship is 42. This in turn leads to more unstable employment for all academics who have not yet reached this career stage. University statistics show that in this year, 92% of academic staff at universities under the age of 45, which excludes professors, are employed on fixed-term contracts. Furthermore, the average contract duration for doctoral researchers is only 22 months, and for postdocs, 28 months. So it's an average. Third-party project funding at universities has also risen, also leading to more fixed-term contracts. The ratio was about 27% in 2018 in comparison to state funding. To complete this picture, the German Act on Fixed-Term Contracts in Science and Humanities, which is called the Wissenschaftszeitvertragsgesetz, limits also the maximum duration of basic funded university positions to 6 years before and 6 years after completing the PhD. And to conclude from this, in academic systems where there are high rates of fixed-term project contracts and where it is very common to have long periods of qualifying for professorships instead of permanent positions, there is, or seems to be, a high probability of researchers becoming unemployed at different stages of their careers. And in the event of becoming unemployed, the unemployed will find him or herself in 2 different settings, social security settings, depending on whether one has been employed for at least 1 year before becoming unemployed and was contractually obliged to pay taxes for unemployment insurance. At the same time, this person would receive 60 to 67% of the former wage. In addition, in order to receive unemployment benefits, the person must prove that he or she applies for jobs on a regular basis. After 1 year of unemployment, one would downgrade to the second option. Also, if a person has been working for less than a year, has received a non-taxable scholarship, or, as I said before, has been unemployed for more than a year, there would only be basic security covering the basic costs of living, which is a little above 400 euro for single persons. But in case the household income is too high, one would receive no unemployment benefits at all. So that is a specific situation in Germany. Anecdotal evidence from qualitative studies shows that unemployment is a very common phenomenon that affects many disciplines. If a researcher finds himself or herself in a position of being unemployed, the following ways of dealing with the situation emerges. Unemployment seems to be used as a phase in the process of leaving research. It can also be a pure waiting phase until the next research position starts, a phase for the search for new academic positions, or it can be used as a conscious choice to carry out certain research activities. And there we found some examples. It can be used for the development of new research topics. It was used for data collection, interaction with former colleagues, or publishing. From our own project, we have an example for this conscious choice or even strategic choice, which I will read out. Of course, I could have gone back to an alternative job outside academia, but I didn't want to because I was qualified for unemployment benefits and I still had to finish my dissertation. And then I thought, okay, I'm still missing a chapter that I have to finish. And I just thought, at least I want to be able to finish that in peace, and then I'll go back to work. Unemployed researchers who want to stay in academia have to face very individual situations. Family health, the financial situation, and the attractiveness of neighboring labor markets can lead to the consideration of focusing on more secure jobs outside academia. But also the German Unemployment Office puts pressure on unemployed researchers by urging them to apply to jobs outside academia or by applying financial sanctions if unemployment is used exclusively for unpaid research. But the focus in this presentation lies on the conditions of the disciplines itself for being able to conduct research while being unemployed. For instance, academics who need the lab to conduct the last experiments. If these experiments cannot be completed due to unemployment, publishing might not be possible. Fewer publications make it then more difficult to apply for highly competitive positions. And also timing matters, which adds an individual dimension to the epistemic factor. If, for example, unemployment sets in before or during data collection, for example, in field research, analysis and publication cannot be carried out because no or hardly any data are available. However, if the data have already been collected, it is possible to analyze them in the episode of unemployment and also to publish the results. Which part of the research process can be conducted during unemployment at all depends on the research field. Now we will demonstrate some selected empirical findings of our ongoing project on unemployment in academia. We will compare two disciplines, which are sociology and ethnology, to show how unemployment is processed. It is sometimes similar, sometimes differently processed according to the nature of the discipline. There are more disciplines to come in the course of the project. So it is funded by this project. Functions and Consequences of Unemployment in Researchers' Careers is funded by the DFG, the German the big funding organization. And this is going to be a selection of research practices that I will show here, and I will start with data collection. Unemployed researchers in both disciplines reported that they did not collect new data during their episode of unemployment. Although there would have been the possibility to do so in at least sociology, the sociologists and ethnologists did not need to because they had enough data at hand. Interestingly, there are differences between the disciplines, especially in ethnology. The idea of doing ethnographic research during an episode of unemployment is more or less absurd, since it would take an enormous amount of time to interact with the field. Sorry, I need to close the door. Sorry for that. Especially in ethnology, the idea of doing ethnographic research during an episode of unemployment is more or less absurd, since it would take an enormous amount of time to interact with the field. Furthermore, this field work needs to be done abroad, since ethnology in Germany requires researchers to go abroad as well as to change topics after the dissertation. Research stays abroad, again, are financially difficult to arrange during unemployment, as well as restricted by the unemployment office. The longer unemployment would last and the existing data is used, the already existing data is used up for publications, the less it will be possible for ethnologists to produce research contributions, because no new data can be generated during unemployment. Sociologists, on the other hand, are limited to collect new data due to technical resources that are only provided by the university. But they face also the risk of not being able to produce new data at a later stage of unemployment. The second activity is data analysis. This happened during unemployment, especially in connection with previous project research, Because the focus during the financed period was on data collection, the analysis has been outsourced into unemployment. Here we found no differences between the disciplines. Another research activity was reading and literature work and keeping up with the field. That happened too during the unemployment phase, as long as the access to literature was assured. I will come to that in a few seconds when I will be talking about workarounds. Informal communication also happened during the unemployment phases. It means everything from all kinds of meetings to casual talks with fellow researchers. Depending on how well the researchers were still integrated with their local research environment, this was used as a way to keep in touch with former colleagues. A slight difference was found. Ethnologists would, in general, work more individually and remote and therefore have less contacts anyway. Still, they kept contact at various occasions. In the long run of unemployment, ethnologists seem to have a higher risk of losing their contracts and becoming excluded, since simply the amount of contact seems to be less in comparison to the sociologists. So losing one means that the risk of becoming excluded is higher. Another research activity done in unemployment is writing publications. Writing publications and the work that goes along with it was the most reported research activity, with no differences between the two disciplines, especially when unemployment was to be expected soon. Writing, reading, and correcting papers were planned for this period. Of course, writing only works insofar as there is enough interesting content to write about, while input from previous work is necessary. But all our sociologists and ethnologists were able to finish the data collection before becoming unemployed and use this as an input. Lastly, attending conferences and workshops was also still happening during unemployment, but with constraints. Since participation fees and travel costs are not covered anymore, the personal financial situations and the costs and distance of events played an important role. Here are some conditions. There are some conditions for research activities that depend on the organization. Some of them are also accessible during unemployment, provided workarounds are found to secure them. One example is library access, or the use of electronic services like the university email. That is usually needed for What is usually needed for that is affiliation with the university in some way, either as a visiting scholar, as an associated member, or as a student. Here I have an interesting quote for that. Now I am an associate member of the institute, which means that I am a member of university, ex-university. Which is a good thing, because I can write ex-university on all my things. I can keep my email account, I can use existing structures, and I don't have to apply as a private person. For instance, when I apply at a call for papers, I can still do that as a member of ex-university, and this will also appear on the paper. Similar to the workaround above, keeping access to the previous working environment also provides for some of the necessary working conditions. In addition to an integration into local workflows, this might also have an effect of a higher dependency on colleagues, depending on the way you achieve this access. Here, quote, I can still use my old office, but only if my ex-colleague opens up. I work with my laptop and I have access to the university network here. So everything is the same, except that I am dependent on my colleague. But today I wrote to the IT department and the secretary to see that to see if they could assign me key rights. So very interesting ways of trying to reintegrate. Especially in institutions like in situations like unemployment, personal contacts might not only be useful for getting a new position, but also for securing resources to continue research activities during unemployment. 2 examples that we found here were help in accessing literature and cooperations regarding grants and proposals. And a very last workaround was, thinking of cheating on the unemployment office. Yeah, as a last workaround, we want to steer attention to the financial situation. Some unemployed researchers are in the fortunate position of being able to continue to do research by covering their living expenses, for instance, through their partner's income. Others are dependent on unemployment benefits. However, this is only paid out under certain expectations, namely that the researchers are available to the labor market and that their main working hours are devoted to application activities. However, if more time is used for research activities, financial sanctions may be imposed. And we have indications in the empirical material that research activities are not declared as they should be in order to continue receiving unemployment benefits. Reasons for this are clearly expressed. Only the completion of the qualification work, such as the completion of a dissertation, enables academic advancement. But the Labor Office, however, cannot follow this logic. Yeah, here we have this nice quote. But I'm allowed, yes, I'm allowed. Theoretically, I'm not allowed to work much on the dissertation, but I have to devote myself to other things in order to be able to receive these unemployment benefits. But do you do that? Do you do it anyway? Yes, of course. So this person works on the dissertation more than the limited hours that the unemployment office would allow. So now I come to the conclusion, and that looks a bit broken, but hopefully that doesn't matter here. Yeah, the main question was, to what extent are unemployed research included or excluded from the scientific community? We found that unemployed researchers from sociology and ethnology are all low-level included into the scientific community because they use the community's body of knowledge during unemployment episodes. Researchers from both disciplines carry out the same research practices, such as reading literature or taking part in informal communication settings, because they seem to appear to have the or similarities in their practices. Ethnology and sociology seem to be pretty close, and methods are partially overlapping. Practices that cannot be conducted, such as data collections, also overlap between the 2 disciplines. Another finding was that unemployed researchers from sociology and ethnology are also medium level included because they offer new knowledge in form of publications to the community. All of them have published recently or are about to finish publications. Some say that they even have more time to do so while being unemployed. Also, both disciplines mention that their collected material is so rich that it easily offers more possibilities to publish. But we can't say actually anything about the actual uses of the publications that are offered to the community. So we can't say actually anything about whether they are on the highest level of integration. But what else can we say? Yeah, we can say that there are 2 trade-off arguments why research researchers from both disciplines are or will become less included. The first point is, due to less legitimation, less time and less resources, research activities are carried out, but already on a smaller scale. And the second trade-off might be that there is no short-term exclusion at the moment, at this particular moment in their episode. But exclusion in the long run is to be expected when unemployment continues, especially for ethnology, which must face a time when new data collection is definitely not possible. The future, in the future, we plan to have a look at altogether 6 disciplines, and we expect to find more and less included disciplines. It can, for instance, be expected that researchers from disciplines that require hardly any resources also might be more included. So thank you very much for listening to it, and I'm glad if you have some questions.
Thank you, Susanne, very much. I would suggest, because the time is a bit running out, so unless there is a burning question from the audience, let's see, on this topic, because I would suggest that we go on with another presentation and revisit the questions, take questions, gather them and use them at the end, if that's okay for you. Yeah? All right. Then we move on to Eleonora Dagienė, who is working at Mykolas Romeris University in Lithuania, and who is doing her PhD at Leiden University in the Netherlands, CVTS, and she will be presenting some of her findings, from what I understand, from her doctoral thesis and her field work in Lithuania. And today she will talk about inclusion aspects arising from conversations with Lithuanian academics and politicians. So, Eleonora, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Liudvika. And I will share my screen. Can you see it? Yes, thank you. So today I will present only initial findings, just to let you know. And so I would appreciate your questions and comments. And in fact, I will see what. Okay, good. In November 2018, I started my PhD research seeking to investigate the Lithuanian quantitative research evaluation and its unintended consequences. In the beginning, I have been exploring the Lithuanian research assessment policies, and more precisely, how policymakers incentivize researchers published with the most prestigious channels, journals, and publishers. And I found out that the legislation reflected ambitious goals and a strong desire that researchers become a part of global knowledge production. And reading every policy, you feel how policymakers wish to have Lithuanian researchers equal participants in a global knowledge production process. So, and from this legislation, I found that since 1998, articles published in prestigious Northwestern journals of books issued by globally recognized publishers became the currency, shaping researchers' career paths and enriching their research possibilities as well. But the bibliometric analysis of outputs revealed outcomes contrary to policymakers' expectations. According to the latest official statements, the internationalization of national research is still insufficient, and these statements forced me to delve into researchers' experiences, because data based on human experiences is more powerful and sometimes more compelling than quantitative data. And to be honest, I was not disappointed taking this challenge, because qualitative research is really a huge challenge. So in my qualitative research, inclusion emerged as one of the significant and contentious issues. This is why I organized this event and invited Jochen with his great experience. So this presentation will be a story compiled from experiences of 55 participants, and I'm incredibly grateful to all of them for openly sharing their achievements, disappointments, and insights. And from the beginning, I decided that there should be politicians, administrators, research administrators, and researchers themselves, because I had these expectations. And in fact, nine of them were participants were indicated as bureaucrats because they did not pursue research at that time when they acted as policymaker. Instead, they get salaries for administrating research activities at the ministry, the research council, or other governmental institutions. So I contacted these personalities because they contributed to the evolution of the research assessment system in one or another way. Almost all of them, as I found later, were awarded PhDs from Vilnius University, the most prominent university in Lithuania. Also, there are 46 participants were affiliated with 15 research institutions. 15 out of 46 interviewees were research administrators at higher education or research institutions. They were former or active rectors, vice rectors, deans, or heads of research departments, and 7 of them were or are still involved in active national policy making. And I feel like they are the high-level authorities at the ministries, research council, the Lithuanian University Rectors Conference, or other national governmental institutions. 31 researchers were standing at different academic hierarchy levels at universities. And however, only 12 out of 31 researchers serving at the Research Council of Lithuania, various committees. So they also were actively involved in policymaking according to the Lithuanian regulations. So as you can see, almost all universities represented and all disciplines. And also I'm so really happy that I found that almost the times, and there are more over 50 years and only slightly less younger people. So in fact, when I began this qualitative research project, I realized that I was unaware of researchers' experience, even though I worked for the university for more than 30 years. First of all, I was an academic publisher, and I learned about journal publishing from the traditional academic publishers. So my first internship was at Oxford University Press Journals Department. Later, I managed co-publishing of university journals with Thiel and Francis for 7 years. And also I broadened my understanding of academic journal publishing when I served on the Crossref board and the Association of Lithuanian Serialists. But in reality, my knowledge was from a publisher perspective or more administrator. And when I started my PhD studies, I entered the ivory tower and I was dreamed about. However, I hadn't imagined that it's so complicated to investigate science system being within this system. And I feel like an ethnographer, what explained at the qualitative courses and recommendations. And also Mykolas Romeris University has based me almost entirely on field work. And as a PhD student at Leiden University and researcher at Mykolas Romeris University, I attended various courses organized by Vilnius University, Kaunas University of Technology, Vytautas Magnus University, and Klaipėda University. And I met many academicians and was really felt very warm welcomed and really felt very comfortable. And there I met also more researchers than I said, more than 55, who agreed to share with me their experience. So as it is suggested for ethnographers, I took notes after meetings, after returning from this conversation, and really I was astonished how openly the Lithuanian researchers talked to me, and that's really nice because I get a deeper understanding of whole academic research system, but only from research system, as we spoke about, not about teaching or lecturing. Nevertheless, I examined really the most contradictory evidence, searching for additional supporting information. I was looking for information publicly available on social, mass media, or other sources, or just return to those people who agreed to share their knowledge and asking them further questions. And additionally, to be confident, I investigated bibliographic data, bibliometric indicators, and researchers' network. Really, it was really big work. And what I can see that our attempts to identify a group of policymakers were really unsuccessful, because every person involved in policymaking in Lithuania was associated with one or another university or research institutions. It looked like only academicians were engaged in the creation of the Lithuanian science system. It was really difficult to distinguish. This is why in the final, I'm still not aware who is really policymakers and who are researchers. And this, when you will see the quotations I provided, it was really difficult to decide if it is on the researcher side or policymakers. And one more thing, that it was really challenging for me, because many researchers said, Leonora, it's impossible to analyze both, and policymakers and academicians, because you need to do one thing, not two at the same time. So I'm sorry if you disagree with me, but I took this challenge. So I found that no research policymakers are working outside academia, and representatives of each discipline contributed to the Lithuanian science system, to creating, and even they lacked understanding of major development and trends in whole global science system and its environmental. They did this contribution from their experience and from their enrichment. And what I also found, they all shared, it was so, they did that wholeheartedly. They wanted the best for Lithuania, and it was really, when you're reading, okay, that I feel how they want to have Lithuania better system, and how they okay, I will share more things later. So what I found, it was really striking and shocking. This the Magic 15 I called it is. Since November 1996, Lithuanian researchers in any discipline must have 15 journal articles if they want to get a professor title, or get a senior researcher position, or get funding, and be the expert or member, or participate in doctoral committees or production. So it looks like this, I really don't know how it's worked, why 15? But anyway, to preserve their positions, researchers should keep publishing papers and have at least 5 articles over their 5-year tenure. And Lithuanians also, some persons say, after working for 15 years, I only now have my agreement with university not terminated, but now I could work more relaxing. So, and even more, every doctoral student should publish at least 2 papers before the defense of their doctoral thesis. And also, it's really stressful for doctoral students because I know I'm a lucky one that my PhD is in the Netherlands, where I don't need supposed to publish papers, only writing thesis. So how they achieved this 15? I saw that the special Lithuanian journal list was introduced simultaneously as the magic 15. And discovery of the evolution of the national journal list was quite complicated. There was not possible to identify neither the initial nor the final list of included journals or track the development of the national journal list. I found several regulations, but it was really challenging. And what I think, I found Tadas Juknevičius, the person who everyone knows and many mentioned over interviews. I haven't really spoke with him in person, but anyway, he published so many papers. And he said the number of normative acts alone testifies that first, the problem, the national journal list, was artificially created and later bureaucratically deepened. And also he said articles in special journals have been valued far more than others. And the segregation of periodicals into prestigious and non-prestigious ones led to the fierce fight between the lobbies. One of the outcomes of this struggle is a pile of new journals set up urgently by institutes, universities, and their departments, expecting to push them into the national journal list. It's all about inclusion, even I am not saying this word or term. So, and I remember that policymaker once said, if I remember correctly, it was a suggestion apparently from the institution that research papers cannot be published anywhere. Researchers should publish their articles in normal journals. They mean peer reviews, which the scientific community reads. It's always policymakers' view, but it also came from the universities. So, and also, I found very nice book. That's really a great book. It's called Lietuvos mokslo politika Europos, Lithuanians and policy in the European context. But it was also like a statement and view from policymakers that researchers of institutions having deficient research potential cannot get papers published in prestigious international journals. So such institutions see local periodicals as the only way out. Even more, having institutionally published scientific journal means securing survival in the system. And also, in this is a quotation from this book, just translated into English. Nobody has experienced any problems with peer review in Lithuania because reviewers are usually colleagues and acquaintances. In fact, there is no selection. Sooner or later, virtually all manuscripts are published. And reading the book gives the impression that politicians relied on external judgment outside Lithuania. They also believe that papers published abroad definitely are of higher quality than those published locally because of peer review done by foreign researchers, not relatives or friends, they supposed. Above all, politicians trusted the Web of Science selection process for scientific journals, and this should ensure only high-quality journals were indexed. And consequently, they believe that papers in ISI journal reflect the quality of scientific work. And here you can see how it's different. It was really Science Citation Index. There are many, many papers. And only few social sciences citation and arts and humanities. So could you imagine when in 2001, with such really, I could say despite a world of difference, as you observe in this figure, in 2001, policymakers imposed new requirements for minimum qualifications, academic titles, doctor degrees, and doctor studies. They mandated papers in the SI journals, calling them the list of international journals. Only philologists were exempted from the obligation to have at least 2 or 1 articles in the journals, ISI journals. And this regulation, in fact, strengthened the previous requirement for senior researcher and professor to have 15 peer review articles in the national journal list. So it's really actually announcing that this is compulsory requirements. They say, okay, this come into force in 2006. So they gave researchers 5 years to acquire qualifications for publishing in ISA journals. It's really was, I don't know how it's called, it's really too ambitious, I would say now. And we decided to incentivize people. If they had already done a good job, participate in conference or somewhere, we wanted to encourage them not to be lazy, but publish in Web of Science journals, because the country looked sad. And also policymakers' view, I remember that time very well, when they said that there is no need to pay attention to the unknown private database. You may say so, but if the whole world uses this private database, it makes sense. And you feel that it is really from researcher from the sciences. And researchers say at the time there was a great deal of dissatisfaction among the humanities with the direct and rather mechanical application of the criteria of the natural sciences in assessing the outputs of the humanities and social sciences. And we see it always, these rules depends on the group of these researchers that take managing the all Lithuanian regulations and science system. And researchers also said that in Lithuania, academia could hear describing science as a good, bad, and priority. Good science for Lithuanian policymakers means natural sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, and partly mathematics, while applied science, technology, agriculture, and others fall in the bad category. No one doubts that Lithuanian philology took priority over everything else. However, policymakers denied the importance of priority sciences by choosing an US database to evaluate science. So this was also from researchers that, speaking straight, they have always been representatives of some disciplines at the Research Council. Some time ago, there have been mathematicians, now more physicists, who are there to dictate the idiotic regulations. Sorry, it's translated. All those quartiles and quantities. And look at how many publications do they publish per year? Dozens of authors and publications. So it is really not all sciences publish so many publications per year. And researchers predictably accused the policymakers of incompetence, explaining that in endless papers, there are really many publications available, and some not available online, but available in the National Library Archive. And here the ruling of the Constitutional Court, because researchers, when they see that they cannot achieve something in their discussion, or policymakers not taking any action after publicly expressed opinion, they brought policymakers to the Constitutional Court and use this instrument quite often. But I would say it was a two-axis dilemma. One axis is international and Lithuanian publications, and the other axis is quantitative and qualitative evaluation. And also, because at that time there was no such clear criterion of international. Everything was calculated based on the number of publications. And there was a very pervasive culture of the massive publication of paper. Yes, this is numbers, and I know one researcher said, you know, because of these numbers, we sometimes don't know the exact name of these researchers, but we are sure how many papers he has published, that if he could be the leader of the project or not, if he could be an expert or not. So we better know the numbers affiliated with the person, that his name. But it was like, yeah, so this this number and quantification in Lithuania. So we see that, of course, the ISI is probably not valid for social science and humanities, but then how to define this international for the humanities, social sciences? And it seemed to me that it is not really very clear so far. And as we can see, after 2 decades, both policymakers and the academic community had become disappointed with metric-based assessment. And so in 2014, the comparative expert assessment was introduced. And once again, foreign experts pointed out how low the level of internationalization remained. They concluded that while the incentive system that have been put in place to publish internationally are to be commended, the current structure of such motivational systems need to be revisited. For social sciences and humanities, they strongly recommended ranking of the national journals. And really, I think that it's nice that the policymakers now take this recommendation. I do agree with them. And in 2018, foreign experts still emphasized journal metrics. It was interesting that the expert assessment, but experts anyway take care about these ranks of journals and use metrics in their evaluation. They say, although there is a high number of publications, many of these are in low-ranking journals. But in fact, the science system is extremely complex system and really can be seen as an expanding and constantly evolving network of ideas, scholars, and papers. And even the separate science investigated that. And I like the Dakota Murray dissertation. It's really taken like the concepts from complexity of science. And he, in his dissertation, he did 4 different topics, but very, very connected to the science system and the complexity theory. So he writes that past approaches were view scientists as isolated, singular, static. However, each researcher is embedded in a broader and dynamic social system, what Jochen explained very clearly and very nicely today. And at the same time, researchers are complex individuals with their own characteristics, making choices about their career, what we hear in Susie's presentation, not only in Jochen as well. So we can see they have their autonomy, but their connection and networks are non-linearity, and hierarchical structure in the science is very, very strong. I sometimes feel that maybe it's too strong in Lithuanian research system or academia, because I feel that in the Netherlands and the university or center I now pursue my PhD research, I feel more comfortable. I could contact senior researchers and even they communicate with doctoral students, or I contacted Jochen and he responded to me being professor in German. So that's for me, it seems that in Lithuania, to be honest, I'm really afraid to contact some professors or academicians still. So, and also, so what I wanted also saying about inclusion, as we can see in the UNESCO science report towards 2030, people from different backgrounds contribute to science worldwide. We see the competition, we see these tensions. Even the researchers should compete in their local systems. They really should work or contribute to the global knowledge at the international level. And then they need other individuals who have their expectations and willingness to communicate or not. That's really extremely difficult inclusion issue in international level as well. So as you can see, this growth in papers and numbers of researchers. So that's I highlighted. And when we see from policymakers, if they understood or know this, because we really have a culture in humanities where a large part of publications are published in Lithuanian. It means that our scientific knowledge is not widely visible to international research community. Thus, we make a little contribution, and this forms a kind of separation. They understand that. And at the same time, regarding internationalization, although we wanted to take at least a step towards that internationalization, we understood that the system was not ready to help the researchers, where there was no elementary editing of those English publications. But what is interesting that it's just looking at language, but from my perspective, language not the, you could have the best language, the greatest ideas, but you still would not be accepted by this international community. So, and from researchers' side, they say quite often it is even too difficult for us to understand their rules. I would say we just think differently, live in different cultural environments, even different commercial environments. I should be honest, from myself, I am really have a great supervisors, and they help me enormously, but I feel that sometimes I need to explain them more to make them aware why I keen on some things which for them looks, no, it should not bother you, but I want to be clear or more be confident. And these hours of discussions help me to it's like mutual understanding and this really being in the field. So this is, I'm once again say that I'm a lucky one, having great advisors who help me to understand this, the Western world, what is not the same, and I need to understand this better while I'm being in this Eastern European environment. So also from researcher side, it is easy to publish a paper in Lithuania and abroad, I don't know. It took about 2 or 3 years before one article was finally accepted. Well, sure, significant improvements were needed. Anyway, will I submit it to a foreign journal to delay me for 2 or 3 years? I will never do that again. I think this quotation shows why so many papers now are published with this questionable, maybe not questionable, but MDPI journals, which it seems accept easier these Lithuanian articles, but not only Lithuanian. So also from researcher side, colleagues from COST project have noticed such an interesting thing that scholars are usually like kind people, but even kind persons become the beasts when they get to review works written by their rivals. They fiercely look at your manuscript. Thus, very often reviews are aggressive, angry, hostile. Yes, and really it was not very good. I understood this experience. And the one more quotation from researchers. Currently, if you want to be a professor in Lithuania, you need 2 things. First, you should be a member of the clan. And the second, you should have journal papers. So, but this is a last quotation, and because today I only wanted to say, and it is another piece of inclusion in local community, but I want to finish with this quotation that in Lithuania, the academic world is highly influential in making various political decisions. And my conclusion would be that in fact, in Lithuania, there is no research policymakers outside academia, really, because researchers by themselves decide what they want to do, how they want to see, and they support even those recommendations. There were many advices, but still, Lithuanian policymakers or researchers acting as policymakers, they not took any advice blindly. They always fit into the Lithuanian environment, and this is also show that they have their opinion and they shape the this system. So thank you. It's all what I wanted to share with you today.
Thank you very much, Eleonora. I could recognize quite a few things. It reminded me of my master thesis from 2002, where one of the key findings was that academic oligarchy is at the forefront of the governance of higher education system. So it hasn't changed since then. As with the previous speaker, I would suggest that we continue and we gather questions for Eleonora towards the end of the session. That's okay, Eleonora, with you? All right, so then we can move on to the next speaker. I don't know if Gus is with us. I hope so. Yes. Welcome and hello. Gus Dix, he is just recently appointed as assistant professor at University of Twente in the Netherlands, where I have privileged to have worked for many years, and now I'm visiting there. He will talk today about including impact, the measurement and governance of societal impact in contemporary higher education. So with no further ado, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. Let's see, I'll share my screen. And I hope you can see it now. Yes, and that's something that so this is full screen, right? Okay. Thank you very much, Eleonora, for the invitation to present here, and thanks a lot to the audience for listening in. What I'm going to present to you today is a research project in the making. It's actually a research proposal, but then turned into a presentation mode, in which I focus on impact policies, so science governance, science policy on the one hand, but also practices of creating impact. So it might have that somewhat tentative form that simply comes with the proposal stage, although I'm way more happy usually of presenting findings, because it's a safer thing to do for a social scientist or a scientist in general. But anyway, so today I'll talk about impact. That's the main word to remember, but I also relate it to the theme of inclusion, because I think impact and inclusion are very much related in contemporary academia. And I'll start with a few scenes to get a sense of what impact means nowadays. Biomedical scientists, whom I studied before, discern an increased demand for clinical impact, and they worry about its consequences. A junior researcher working on a molecular level laments that, quote, patients, of course, don't see the relevance in that. But what she fears more than the patient's lack of understanding is what could happen on the somewhat longer run with her field of work, or a field of work that she holds dear. Quote, so what's happening now, looking at all the Venis and Vidis, that's a prestigious Dutch research grant, by accident also the one that I'm applying for, is that a lot of proposals closer to the clinic get the money because whatever. And now we don't really notice the effect, but in 10 years we will definitely notice it. The focus on clinical impact, another professor adds, is strengthened by the access that clinical departments have to financial resources of pharmaceutical companies. Quote, you also have to realize that big pharma is on top of it. It pours a lot of money into this kind of research, and a lot of money goes especially to these clinical departments. The institutional support for impact is key here as well. A clinical professor who evaluated an impact-oriented university medical center scorns the board of directors for putting, quote, too much emphasis on impact and valorization, saying, it's your choice, but to the best of my knowledge, a dead alley. What are you going to translate to the clinic, and what are you going to valorize when there is no new valid information obtained in good basic and clinical research, unquote. The perspectives of researchers, in this case in the life sciences, does not stand on its own. Since the 2008 financial crisis, the idea that researchers could and also should increase the societal impact of science regained momentum in the national and European policy arenas. European policymakers, for instance, are convinced that it is possible and desirable to incentivize scientists to deliver relevant solutions for the problems we face today. Although policymakers are themselves caught up in a political struggle to define relevant research foci, They share the idea that academic supply should be better aligned with political and private sector demand, so as to increase economic competitiveness and address societal challenges. If policymakers could only find the right indicators and incentives, they could steer research in more desirable directions. And with a consortium, I recently evaluated European science policies, more in particular what they call the focus area approach under Horizon 2020. After we had presented our plans at DG RTD, so the Director General for Research and Innovation in Brussels, the highest ranked European civil service in the room had only one real question for us, and that's the quote here. Can you find out what the impact is of all the projects that we have funded, and can you thereby show that our policies themselves had a positive impact on European society? Of course, the second highest official was quick to add, when the first one had left the room, there was no question that they would try to steer us in the direction of positive results for the European Commission. But of course, spending so much money on research, we had to understand the political desire to be accountable to the taxpayer. And this brings me to impact scene number 3. Scientometricians, so quantitative researchers on research in the public and the private sector, have developed new quantitative indicators that cover the science-society relationship. And thereby they strengthen the political and administrative belief in the measurability and the manageability of impact. This started around the late 2000s, so 2009, for instance, a consortium of researchers depicted the question how to measure societal impact as still, quote, largely unanswered. They were funded by the European Commission and aimed to develop a ready-made set of indicators to measure the effects of science on society. Over 10 years later, a different consortium still aimed to, quote, empower policymakers to steer research and innovation towards greater impact. In line with recent developments in the United Nations, it now focuses on what is in vogue, namely sustainable development goals. And they seek to find, quote, clear policy pathways to align investments in science, technology, and innovation to contribute to SDGs, as their abbreviation goes. Despite the continuous effort to measure societal impact, and also its quick commercial uptake, there are still major inconsistencies in measurement practices. In a recent seminar, where I was a participant observer, public and private sector scientometricians came together, and it became clear that what counts as impactful research changes very drastically depending on relatively arbitrary decisions about data collection and data analysis. So the kind of search string, the algorithmic search string that you use to say this paper actually contributed to this societal development goal, that is something that is changes very fast, very quick if you simply add some other keywords that might also relate to the societal development goal. It's safe to say that societal impact, relevance, and valorization have emerged over the past decade, past 2 decades perhaps, as a crucial but divisive phenomenon in science and science policy. Put concisely, the rise of impact covers the increased political, administrative, and epistemic pressures to produce scientific knowledge that allegedly has direct relevance for society. And this is at root also an inclusion phenomenon, I would add. It's an attempt to include impact as a way of judging science, but also as a way of assessing and evaluating sciences. That might be related on the one hand to what Jochen earlier mentioned as the potential of an inclusion bias. And I will elaborate on that a little bit more. Is this an attempt to make science more inclusive by rewarding contributions that are otherwise not seen? Or is it an attempt to change what is now seen as an academic performance in a direction that is more closely related to political objectives? There are 2 features that I think stand out. And the one is, this is all still like we could say an impact regime in the making. So it's all very tentative. But what you see in the Netherlands is that these broader political developments now also start to materialize in academic institutions. One example is that in the University Medical Center that I studied, the dean establishes so-called valorization tracks So you could make a career inside the university medical center, not by way of traditional criteria of publishing academic articles, but by having an impact on a clinical practice. And right now that is scaled up in the Netherlands. So we have a national initiative to perhaps create three different academic tracks at higher education institutions. One traditionally focused on research, and so on publishing articles and books. One on education, but also one centered on impact. Now, these developments haven't materialized yet. They are sort of under discussion. They are broadly discussed by higher education institutions and working groups situated there. But it also shows that this is a moment when that impact orientation might also become part of a way of the type of people that we want and can include in the science system. For me, that inclusion also has a political side. So one element, and I think that is what we focused on so far, is whom we include in an academic community. But that question, if you look at it also from a science policy perspective, is closely related to what kind of knowledge do we include in the policymaking process. And that's a question that is also central to my project. Now, of course, there are already very many social scientific studies out there on the demand to produce relevant knowledge, but there is no overall account yet of the rise of impact as a reality that is distributed over the groups just mentioned. So science policymakers, data scientists who study societal impact, research, academic administrators, third, research groups or research networks, fourth, and societal stakeholders who also want to have a say in what counts as impact. So the project I envision, this is a bit soon, and the project I envision, TROY, or the Rise of Impact, investigates to what extent and to what effect politics and academia have opened the gate. That's the reference, if you know it, from the Greek Trojan reference to the horse, have opened the gate for societal impact and have thereby invited in certain opportunities, but also certain constraints that might come with it. And two such opportunities and constraints stand out. One on the side of science and the other on the side of politics. Some people in academia actually welcome the impact agenda as an epistemic opportunity, a necessary antidote for them to a pervasive excellence regime that was developed from the early 2000s onwards by national and European policymakers. That regime, and I think that's also what we discussed today a lot, consists of highly competitive funding practices that reward academic performance insofar as it can be captured by quantitative indicators for individuals, number of papers, age indexes, and publication outlets, such as the journal impact factor. But as the point of view of the biomedical scientists that I discussed attest, the rise of impacts also lead academics to worry about developments in the production of knowledge, that from their point of view might eventually put the whole scientific endeavor at risk. Scholars in the social sciences and humanities, for one, fear that the explicit economic demands in recent science policies are a threat to their specific contributions and the values that they hold dear. And although they are better positioned vis-a-vis the political demand for impact, researchers in the natural and in the biomedical sciences are also concerned that the demand for direct relevance lead to the decline of basic science that could feed back into more applied work in the future. So these concerns of all these researchers converge in the idea that there might also be epistemic constraints to the increased emphasis on the impact of science. The way we define, measure, and prioritize the societal relevance of certain kinds of research can affect the relationship between basic and applied science, as well as between different scientific fields and subfields. So what kinds of practices, what kind of interventions stand to gain or to lose from the rise of impact? Now, as I mentioned, the effects or on the higher education system are only one element for me in the rise of impact. And the second class of opportunities and constraints is a more political one. Policymakers legitimize their focus on societal impact by emphasizing that scientific knowledge often has little direct bearing on the major societal challenges of the day. The opportunity, and so that's a political opportunity they see here, is that they themselves can have a key role in bringing together fragmented contributions of scholars and these scholars themselves, who seem more engaged in their own academic games than in the attempt to put their knowledge to good use. And that's sort of their framing. If scientists would only have a common purpose and cooperate, they would make it easier to address some of the major challenges we are facing today. Although the route towards cooperation in Europe, in European science policy, is still incredibly competitive. Now, these challenges, and so these broader societal challenges towards which science should be directed, are never simply given. They are defined and redefined by policymakers against the background of what is deemed politically salient at that moment in time. So a possible political constraint of the rise of impact is the emergence of certain path dependencies in the policymaking process. That is, the overall strengthening of certain lines of research can lead to the neglect of, or even the resistance to, research lines that transgress the boundaries of political saliency. And these risks are very much present. When you look, for instance, at the European Commission, they present certain objectives, also certain objectives in science policy, as compatible, such as simultaneously addressing the climate crisis and fostering economic growth. Although there is a lot of scientific evidence and a lot of good scientific reason to believe that these objectives are fundamentally at odds with one another. So the political construction of certain kinds of research foci, certain kinds of missions, certain kinds of focus areas, might hence be biased towards scientific knowledge that aligns with what is politically acceptable, such as the ideas or the belief in green growth or technological innovation, to the detriment of knowledge that somehow challenges the political status quo. Think, for instance, of the degrowth movement or of quick and radical behavioral changes that might be needed to stay within planetary, to allow ourselves to live within the planetary boundaries. Now, these constraints and opportunities are very broad and way too unspecific. That's usually the case at the start of a new research project, and it goes for mine as well. So my research proposal, my research project, TROY, focuses on the dispersed and dynamic rise of a focus on societal impact in science and science policy to make more concrete sense of what are actually the opportunities and constraints of impact policies. And the first objective is the following. My project, TROY, has an empirical ambition, namely to offer a comprehensive view of the rise of impact in science and science policy. As such, it covers the coming into being of a new, potentially new political and academic reality centered on the societal relevance of research that did not exist before to such an extent or in this particular manner. And my project aims to trace empirically how impact arises as something that exists only in between the many different types of actors that are involved in the continuity and change of science and science policy. Now, what it does is it studies, as you saw at the overview, in tandem, the many different empirical sites where the focus on impact is created, debated, measured, instrumentalized, and contested. Studying all these sites simultaneously is not common in research on research. And the main reason I hold is that research is currently quite distributed, one could also say compartmentalized, over different communities that each have a specific interdisciplinary background and empirical focus. And I have participated in I've worked at many centers that somehow have that particular focus. So scholars engaged in higher education studies, for instance, focus mainly on changes at the level of higher education institutions and science policies. They draw on a theoretical vocabulary of public administration and political science and organization studies, and are geared, and this is all very exaggerating, that's what such a comparison often leads to, and are geared methodologically towards single and comparative case study research. If you look at a different community, namely science and technology studies, they directly apply social scientific theories and methods to day-to-day scientific practices, with still a predominant focus on the natural and the life sciences, although that is changing now. As a field of study, STS draws on philosophy, history, anthropology, and sociology, oftentimes with a methodological preference for interpretative methodologies. In other words, there is no shortage on solid work on higher education or on impact, but that work often remains relatively confined to one of the research communities in the broader field of research on research. And that can lead quite easily to rather narrowly designed studies that focus on one of these actor groups or one of these empirical sites in particular. So some studies focus on the history and current development of quantitative indicators, more on that science measurement part, while others focus on the development of European science policies. Some scholars address academic administrators as strategic actors, while others address specific research practices related to impact. And that division of labor is not inconsequential, because if you zoom in on epistemic, on scientific practices from an STS perspective, then political and administrative developments easily become somewhere distant on the horizon. And the same goes for social scientists focused on European science policies, who might not be committed to study the specific research group for a longer period of time to find out what these policies mean on the scientific shop floor. The rise of impact, as I mentioned, is not contained on any of these sites or contained in any of these 5 groups that I outlined. It is dispersed in the sense that different and differently positioned actors have a stake in it, and it is dynamic in the sense that these actors are not self-contained, isolated entities, but encounter and interact with one another in relations of mutual dependency, cooperation, and conflict. So my idea is that impact more fundamentally only exists insofar as these relations between all these actors somehow hold together. And that brings me to the second ambition. If we want to get a better understanding of the rise of impact, as well as of the political and epistemic opportunities and constraints, we need a relational understanding of continuity and change in science and science policy. The complex relations between politics, science, academic administration, measurement groups, scientific practices, stakeholder involvement require a theory that manages to systematically, but also symmetrically, address the connection between these groups while keeping an eye to the specificity of each domain as well. And in developing that relational understanding, I hope to transcend the limits of that compartmentalized field of study, where different research communities address different aspects of research with still too little exchange between them. What does that look like concretely? I've outlined 4 sub-projects where in each focused on one of the groups that I outlined, but in doing so, particularly on the relations that are established within these groups or within these domains with the other actors that I singled out. So the first sub-project centers on the politics of impact and asks how European policymakers try to steer scientists towards societal impact in interaction with those who seek, measure, and engage with it. To answer that question, it zooms in on the complex setting of economic lobbying, political negotiations, and expert consultation that defines EU policymaking. So the questions that stand out there are the following. Which actors and what knowledge and devices play a role, or are allowed to play a role, in the political process whereby certain research foci win out in the European political arena? How are such research foci translated into specific research topics and goals? And what possible research projects are in and excluded in doing so? And finally, what kind of experts are brought in to turn the societal impact demanded of beneficiaries into something one can measure and monitor? I will then particularly focus on recent mission-oriented policies related to climate resilience and climate adaptation. Which brings us to a second group that I outlined, academic institutions. Because societal impact has also become a central focus of academic institutions. Universities are not immune to policy changes, and university administrators as strategic actors can use some of their discretionary power to develop new strategies and shape their research profile. They can stimulate certain research fields or certain lines of research at the cost of others. So the second project zeroes in on 2 universities in the Netherlands that each recently have decided to have to move towards an impact-oriented profile or a set of impact-oriented strategies. But they're also very different. So I ask, how does a more comprehensive university with a broad focus on the humanities and social and behavioral sciences, how does it fare in comparison with a technical university that already has a well-established position in the natural and engineering sciences? How do the differences in funding affordances and constraints, that is, the politics of impact in the previous work package, play into the institutional strategies they develop? In what way are these administrators subsequently able to establish a link with in-house research groups and networks? And which research groups and networks are willing and able to engage with them and with their newfound strategy? And finally, what is the place of quantitative indicators in administrative practices of knowing one's organization and of trying to get a grip on it, to steer it in a different direction? That brings me to the third sub-project that I envision. Related to this new political and administrative demand for impact indicators, a network of researchers emerged over the last decade that has laid claim to expertise on impact-oriented assessment and measurement tools. This network includes university-based scientometricians who study societal impact of science. It consists of consultants and in-house data specialists who use and adapt these tools to the context of higher education institutions, and consists of a number of commercial firms, publishing houses, who create impact-oriented tools and sell these or the services derived from them to faculties, universities, and policymakers. The third project examines what we could call the epistemic side of the rise of impact, asking how and to what consequences quantitative researchers turn societal impact into something measurable and seemingly manageable. And that brings us finally to the what we call acting with impact or engaging with impact. For the rise of impact is not something that simply happens to researchers as mere passive recipients of external changes. Against the background of the institutional and policy drive towards impact, some research groups and networks are better positioned and perhaps also better disposed than others to orient themselves towards the new opportunities and constraints that are offered to them. And the fourth sub-project examines the researcher's side of impact by asking how research groups and research networks with different backgrounds engage with the pressure to engage with impact. And I've selected 3 research groups, 2 of them located at the 2 universities that were selected for work package 2, as well as 1 research network that is unconnected to them and also distributed over various universities, so that cannot draw on one particular institution for one particular university for institutional support. And each of these research groups offers a particular take on climate change as a social and a technical challenge. So my questions here are, what kinds of stakeholders do these groups and networks engage in? And how does that engagement spring from and affect their specific practices of producing knowledge? To what extent are they able to actually relate and become part of the visions and the strategies developed in their institutions, as well as to the missions that European policymakers have developed? What does it mean for them to imagine, to visualize, and to monitor their impacts when projects are designed, planned, and executed? And in how far are these impact-oriented practices and relations represented, or even representable in the quantitative indicators that are studied simultaneously. So I started with an idea of impact that has become more important both in science and science policy, presenting that as part of a broader question about inclusion, and inclusion about what kinds of knowledge or what kind of things count as academic output, count as academic performance, both in science and in science policy, leading to questions about whom to include in the science system. Is that perhaps more traditionally the ones who score well on traditional output indicators or particular kinds of academic performance? Or do we also see a movement at institutions and at the national level towards including people who have a different kind of profile and who perhaps fared less well in the previous excellence regime, as it's called in scholarship? That is all very tentative, as is the case in a project proposal stage. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Really interesting project proposal. I can imagine also there are comments maybe, or as well as questions from the audience, but also from the panelists or the workshop participants today. I would then just start maybe opening with a discussion, if that's okay with everyone. And I would encourage to ask questions to the audience, to all of the speakers, because we had only time for the first speaker to address some of the questions. And I would maybe just go back to the list of questions coming from the audience at the moment. And I already see that there is a question that was posed after Jochen's talk. So the question is, where among these systems could find his place an independent researcher, how he could be included into the academic system? And I would invite Jochen to respond, but also if any other of the colleagues would like to also chip in, you are very welcome. I repeat the question.
I would be happy to answer that. I'm not entirely sure I know, I understand what is meant by an independent researcher.
Mm-hmm.
If the meaning is a researcher that is independent of any academic organization. So
maybe I can ask, is Ida still being in the audience still? Because that was the question from Ida. If she is, you can just maybe pose the question yourself. It can be that she's not there anymore. Sorry, so then I cannot help.
But I could, I know Ida, and I think that Ida want to ask, as I know, she worked on research and qualitative research by herself, like independent, because she currently is not affiliated. Yes, Ida, could you? Yes, I see. Ida is not affiliated in any organization, is about this, and she do her research supervising by some academicians, being not actively employed by any institution, but actively working in the field. So it is like this perspective of background. Yes, Ida, you could say, I see yes, but I don't know if it's after my explanations. But in fact, and I guess she is not a PhD holder. And I think that it is also like how this is mostly related maybe for science. This is like science and the community, or how attract talented people to this academic community, and how defend their and get their degrees. Yes, I said that, yes, that's what she meant, yeah.
Yeah, so no institutional affiliation. This gets you very close to the thing Susanne and Markus presented here. So the big downsides might be that you don't have access to resources, and that you lack the legitimation that comes with an institutional affiliation. So I must admit, in my own research biography, I had some problems because I was unemployed at some time, and then you get all these nice forms for attending a conference, and you have to put in your institutional affiliation. And so there is this problem. The problem is much worse when you start interviewing researchers, and you don't have an institutional affiliation. That gets very, very tricky, because universities guarantee a lot of things, like the seriosity of the research, the whole data protection issue, and so on and so on. So you get, in some cases, serious disadvantages, and not having a PhD degree aggravates the situation, because you, in many cases, are not even eligible to apply for funding. So this is tight. There are, I mean, we have studies on history in Germany where it turns out that, yes, well, historians work as school teachers and try to further their academic career while they do that and try to get back to academia. Researchers work independently, and it really depends on the discipline whether you are able to do that strongly, and for how long you are able to do that. Because there are clear disadvantages of that in terms of access to resources for research and relying on institutional affiliation. So if I should give advice, would be, first thing, try to get yourself an institutional affiliation that is that somehow works, so that you can be a member of a university. And secondly, in Germany, I would urge researchers to get a PhD, because then you can apply with funding councils and can fund your own position at a university. So in Germany, that is pretty much depends on the doctoral degree.
Susanne, would you like to add something to this? No, okay.
Yes,
yeah.
I could, yes. And I think that this situation, it's like what asked Ida. It is like inclusion in local communities, because from my explorations, I see that in Lithuania, academic communities, they are quite close, and it is difficult to enter this community, and it's very dependent on your natural abilities to communicate, and how you communicate and what you communicate, and if they are willing to have you in their circles, and this to get PhD in Lithuania even more bigger extreme, because this community have traditions, and look where yes, it's really defend PhD and enter Lithuanian community, from my experience, and it is really difficult. And I would encourage to be more open, and I found several experiences that some universities already have established this external PhD, self-funded PhD programs, where researchers, as my position at Leiden University, when researchers are willing to research something or pursue a PhD research could be self-funded. So my experience also show I was unemployed for 2 years. And that is very interesting that I wanted to devote all my time for PhD research. And this is why I really rejected very nicely offered positions, because I saw what is a challenge to do PhD research while doing other administrative or other work. And also I want to add that Lithuania, it was like my finding, Lithuania has not big number of PhDs, and a quarter of PhD students just leaving academia world, not finishing PhD, and there are many reasons about that. And this is also, but a society needs those future researchers. So there is also a problem and an issue that need to be discussed. Yes, how citizen science and people who are willing to join the academia or contribute to knowledge generation could do that in the national, first at the local level, not international. Yes, that is my perspective. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Eleonora. So what comes to my mind right away, to what extent the communities are open and closed, right? And would the small systems would be more closed or more open is a question. But of course, it's part of the conditions and culture and so many other factors that Jochen mentioned in his talk. I was also wondering, in your findings, Eleonora, in Lithuania, there were many interesting aspects. I mean, that's clear. What I was curious is that you mentioned about the, this kind of quantification, quantity versus quality dilemma that is happening. But you didn't talk much about quality. It was more about quantity and quantification. So I was curious, did anything on the quality side come out from the interviews? Was it an issue? Was it discussed at all? Like, what is good, research? What is good science? Or was it only to tick the box and to publish or create a journal that would count,
Yes, and that's a very nice perspective. I think that absolutely everyone speaks about quality, and it looks like everyone care about quality, and it's both researchers and researchers acting as policymakers, even bureaucrats, because they want to see Lithuanian better, not lagging behind other countries, but have better metrics, better top one. It is not a surprise. Maybe all think about quality. And this is why this top 10 or top 5 metrics, always about metrics, new indicators that when research funding distributed, and this, they think that top 1, top 5, top 10 publications really reflect quality of research. So, and they do believe in that. But my, yes, about, and what is interesting also, what I found out, but it's really very initial feelings, that everyone care about the system, everyone care about quality, but everyone want to be comfortable sitting in her place. But there are many groups, and the system is very, there are, even in a local small community, there are more smaller groups. And while international system is growing up, and research papers show that only bigger group achieve better results, more visible, better results. Yes, it's really very challenging, but I cannot speak about that very much because I haven't investigated. But quality, yes, the researchers and policymakers care about quality. They want to be included in those international communities. They want also not forget local issues. They want to contribute to local society. Yes, that's yes. This is concern, but and also I asked the policymakers several, why it's still this quantification part is still in the research assessment. And while, for example, when earlier it was 100% of research finding distributed by using quantitative metrics, now it's only 40%. But they see rationale behind this. And I do understand that they have some very interesting arguments why they still keeping this quantitative side. But it's really also we see with emergence of these publications, tomorrow we will discuss, this is MDPI papers, and when we, for example, have almost within a year 20 new experts ready, of 20 professors having 20 or 15 papers within a year, it's like also strange thing happens with this quantification. So, and I see this, there is a challenge for new indicators. It's now I see that it is not important which journal you publish. And the thought crossed my mind that why we need to publish and push their researchers to publish abroad in not unknown journals or not very important or questionable journals, but not publishing in local journal when we know each other, but also well-distributed platforms like MDPI use, for example. It's better perspective, but it's another discussion. But quality, yes, they care about quality, everyone.
But if they do, if there isn't any other question, I would like.
I encourage to discuss.
For a moment, I really wonder whether the contradiction is here between quantity or quality, or whether it exists between output-oriented measures and, let's say, reception-oriented measures. Because if you spend a lot of time and money and you go to Leiden because these people know what they are doing, then you can get a quantitative analysis of citation impact. And if they are sophisticated enough, as I said, if you spend enough time and money, they give you very interesting information on research quality, namely on how you have an impact on the scientific community. So what I'm wondering about is how counting the number of journal publications in any journals could be used as a measure of quality, because that would be, essentially it's a middle level of inclusion, what Susanne talked about. And the reason why I'm asking this is that I'm really, really concerned because I believe I observe a change in attitude among many researchers worldwide who think they have done enough when they published something. And whether somebody reads it is not important anymore at all. So you have a shift from offering something in your publications. It's a shift from being part of a communication process of a scientific community to simply shouting something at an unknown audience. And there are several drivers of that, I should say. I in part blame the cumulative PhD for that, because in order to get your doctoral degree with a cumulative PhD, you just have to publish in certain journals. It doesn't matter whether anybody reads it. Yeah, but I also blame, of course, these kind of publication counts as contributing to that. And we have a whole range of problems because combined with open access, where you can buy your publication space, you get all sorts, not only a ground, not only for for predatory journals, but for all sorts of questionable publication offers, so to speak. So not quantity or quality, but level of inclusion, or simply shouting a lot to whoever will hear you, listen to you, versus being part of a communication process.
Yes, indeed. And here, what I can imagine also shouting a lot. What I was wondering also is the role of social media and self-promotion in addition to publishing, right? So it's also how you communicate your findings to the broader audiences. That is also part of the story, I would imagine. No? Do we have any questions also to our colleagues? I would be very curious, for example, to Susanne, and in her presentation, you talked about careers or disrupted careers because of unemployment. What I was very wondering, but of course, maybe that was not part of your question, is what impact does it have for the career progression? So people take conscious decision not to work, to continue working actually, but being not paid. I know a bit, there is a chunk of literature, especially in the US, on precarious careers and how, basically people are exploited, researchers are exploited and not paid to do certain things. And what impact does it have for the disrupted careers? So I was curious if you in your project are linking to what happens to their careers of all these unemployed but actually working academics.
Thank you very much for that question. Well, there's a lot of stuff in that. So first of all, researchers usually try to conceal that they were unemployed at a certain time in their career. So that's also because it's very difficult to find unemployed researchers or researchers that have been unemployed once, because they just don't write that in their CVs. So from a perspective of work, so from the perspective of the sociology of work, one would say, well, there would be signaling effects of unemployment to the later career, but I think that does not really apply to academics, because first of all, they don't really point it out in their CV, and also they work, so somehow they still are in the production process somehow. The other thing is that, well, I mean, the problem is that we have to ask unemployed people more than once. So and at this moment, we are not at the stage of really being able to talk about what really happens to their careers in the long run. We were only lucky to talk to 2 people that were able to only have very short periods of unemployment and then go back into academia without much of a change, probably. So that is what I can say so far. Markus,
yeah, thanks a lot.
Anything else?
Because I was thinking about inclusion and exclusion, because you found low levels of exclusion, right?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
I was wondering really, okay, so if it's low level, that means that should have no real impact for the careers, that you could continue to be included and continue building, your career.
I think the main point is that the episodes of unemployment were very short. So I guess, as I said in the presentation, if there would be circumstances under which certain usual research activities wouldn't be possible anymore, then it would become definitely a problem for their careers. But that is probably different in different disciplines. And so far, with the sample we had, it's not that bad, I would say. So far.
Thank you. We are running out of time, so I would pose one question to everyone, and anyone can react maybe. So inclusion bias, we talked about different types of biases actually. And when I'm thinking about Lithuanian higher education and research system, I could also, many thoughts came to my mind. You know, I myself have experienced and still experiencing various biases in my own work and career as being a Lithuanian and working in different various systems, as well as being representatives of Lithuanians who studied abroad but tried to come back to Lithuania or not, right? So they've been a lot on this kind of asymmetries of exchanges and communication and building careers, being locals or cosmopolitans and Lithuanians at the same time. So my question would be inclusion bias. How for small countries, for academia in small countries, what would be a way to go forward? If we want to be visible in international communities, if we want to be part of communication and a part of exchange, of building of knowledge, not to be, I don't like now this periphery question, right, or concept, but not to be a periphery, but to become part of a dialogue, actually, two-way dialogue. What would be an advice for the academics in the system? And anyone could react to that, maybe.
I could.
Yes, Eleonora.
Yes, I think that it is biases, and I think that the most important for academia is realize why I wish to everyone realize why I need this broader audience and why I need to communicate my knowledge wider. And with this understanding why I need that, this is much easier to communicate with all these people around. This is just for understanding inside.
Well, that's a tricky question. So the first thing I really don't know, but that comes to mind. Do you really want to internationalize, and where and to what extent? That is something that needs very careful consideration, not least due to what Ruth said. I mean, impact is supposed to be local. And you do have, and some quotes make that pretty clear, you do have a trade-off between international inclusion and local impact. So that's something that needs some very careful consideration. I'm not saying you should do the one or the other, that's pretty clear. I would also say that this varies a lot between disciplines. Yeah, so, but that's sort of the first question that comes to mind. And the second one is, if you want to integrate, then you somehow need to internationalize. You need to systematically include career phases abroad in career patterns. You can have as many national journals and as many national project proposals or grant programs as you want. You would want to internationalize peer review as much as possible. That would be the second thing. I don't know, I mean, one of the things that interests me a bit is how conflict of interest policies work in small science systems. I have no idea, but I interviewed researchers in Australia who told me, well, whenever my project proposal comes up, every researcher who is competent for my project proposal has to leave the room because of conflicts of interest. So the people remaining are not competent for the science and they have to decide. So that would be the normal thing expected. And the only solution to something like that is international peer review. Same applies to journal articles. So I would think there are elements of an internationalization strategy, so career path abroad, internationalization at home, and so on, that could probably be of service if and where internationalization, inclusion in international scientific community is the right thing to do, which is a political decision.
Yeah, anyone else? What I would also maybe add that in Lithuanian context, the Science Council, for example, has been changing the peer review system quite a lot in terms of adding or inviting various international researchers on board. So internationalizing peer review, but this issue of conflict of interest is a huge issue for small systems. So absolutely, because even from the style of writing, one can guess already who is that, right? We can do that in the international community too when we are reviewing. I mean, I see that, it's not always, but sometimes from style of writing, you can already see, and then you are judging, can I review that or not? Because I kind of guess who that is. But you can have that even much more in a small systems. So this is a huge issue, I think, and internationalization is definitely the way. Mobility, absolutely, I agree with that. But I would like to come back to that issue of how people can come back and are they welcome to integrate back? Are they then excluded when they come back from abroad? That's one of the big issues we face and discuss in Futura Scientia association, because many of our members who got PhDs from all over, a lot of US graduates, they have issues in integrating in the system. They don't want to come back because the hurdles are so bad that basically it's not only about conditions for research, but it's also about being not welcome and being an enemy. And being basically, why would we want more competition? So people don't want more competition coming from outside with better skills. Mm-hmm. So there is a huge element of this mobility, which I think very welcome thing to have, like in terms of funding and support of mobility and expectation. But the problem is the system is too small to integrate those who come back. And I think that is an issue that needs to be somehow dealt with and discussed as well.
I think that's an important, a very important point, because if you don't make the people welcome when returning, you create nothing but a brain drain. And this is not something you would want to have. So the question is, when people return, to what kind of positions can they return? Do they return to positions of dependence, where they are dependent on people for whom they are serious competition? That's not good. I mean, this is not necessarily a problem of small science systems. As far as I know, Japan has exactly that problem. Mm-hmm. Of a very close national career system. But there are opportunities to do something about that. For example, if you assess your universities according to the condition they provide for returners, and ask your universities to create truly independent positions for these people. I mean, yes, I know, I talk to people, if you come back into a career system from abroad, where everybody knows everybody else in the science system, and where career stages are informally negotiated between the mandarins, so to speak. It is very, very difficult to work against this kind of system. But again, science policies in many countries have created career paths in situations where this is, let's say, at least a bit weakened this kind of rejection on return, so to speak. Yeah, I know the Spanish system has something, and other systems as well. So essentially, plans for returnees, how to establish returnees at universities.
So now we are running out of time, so I would thank you so much, everyone, for their contributions. Thanks, Eleonora, for arranging and organizing the project, and for inviting me and all the colleagues to participate. It's been really very insightful and also very timely, I would add. So thanks, everyone. And yeah, good luck tomorrow with another discussion with the policymakers. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you. Bye. Bye.